So a lull in the fighting in the Sudanese capital Khartoum, allowing some people to leave their homes for the first time in days to search for food. According to reports, the furious clashes between the rival armies in the city appear to be less intense, but after 10 days of fighting, the Red Cross says the situation for civilians is becoming untenable. Thousands of foreigners and Sudanese have now fled, and as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warns that the situation risks escalating out of control, the Nigerian government announces that it has concluded arrangements to evacuate more than 5,000 Nigerians, many of them students, who are trapped in Sudan.
Caste or something, like you see other countries evacuating their nationals, they're eager, they're showing that care. They're valuing their lives, but for us, our own country is just full of excuses. There is no money, it's going to cost a lot. Is it that the money is more valued than 4,000 lives of Nigerian citizens living in Sudan, for God's sake? Though we can say that we are from poor backgrounds, all of us here, but that is not a reason for us to be ignored. We are really pained. We cry to the extent that, tears cannot come out anymore. Everyone has been stranded. There is no hope of survival. Everyone is just running helter-skelter, looking for shelter to survive. And these people, they're fighting. It's like they don't value human lives. They don't care about anyone. And we are on a state of, breaking.
And that's a fairly distraught Nigerian student there who is in Sudan. Well, for more analysis on the crisis in Sudan, I'm joined now from our studios in London by the former British diplomat and current director of the Royal African Society, Dr. Nicholas Westcott, who served as the European Union's managing director for Africa and as the EU's MD for the Middle East and North Africa. He's also a professor of practice in diplomacy at the SOAS Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy at the University of London. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Westcott, for joining us. I really appreciate the time that you've taken, because I know it's been a long day for you, and for going to our studio as well. And you heard that young man in the clip there, I'm presuming you did, but he's a Nigerian student who feels abandoned. Some have suggested that while other countries are staging rapid and complex operations to bring their citizens out of Sudan, many Africans say they feel abandoned there, and that the response from their governments have been at best feeble, although we've been assured by the Nigerian Foreign Ministry that evacuations will begin on Tuesday. What are you hearing about all that?
The situation is extremely grim, especially for civilians. Effectively, the economy is broken down, transport is broken down, they can't get food, they can't get water. And all those who can would like to leave. And I think in every country there are some who have been lucky and have been able to get out, and others who have not and who feel that they've been abandoned. So the situation these students are in is not unfamiliar to others, but governments have had to start where they can in getting people out, and those governments with more resources, particularly in the region, have been quicker and able to get more of their nationals out. For the Nigerians, they have no military in the area, they have no bases in the area. It's very hard for them to get there because there is no local authority who can assure the safety of these civilians. Basically, you have to provide it yourself. And there is an international coordination amongst the foreign governments trying to maximize their access to the civilians who need to get out. But it's an extremely fraught situation because there is no guarantee of anyone's safety. And therefore, unless you can bring in critical force, you can't assure the safety of the civilians who you're trying to get out.
That's a very good point, and that's a point that was, by coincidence, raised by the Nigerian Foreign Minister this evening, Jeffrey Onyama. I spoke to him on the phone to get an update, and those were almost exactly the same things he said. But beyond that, Professor Westcott, what does it say about the seriousness of the situation in Sudan that we now see diplomats and foreign nationals leaving and so many countries trying to get people out? It all looks pretty bleak, doesn't it?
It implies that there is no longer a role for diplomats to play in this circumstance. There is no basis for either side to even start talking to each other. We've had 4 or 5 attempts at a ceasefire. They all broke down as the military dynamics took precedence for both sides. They are still both fighting for control of the key infrastructure parts, and we've seen it on our television screens. So the fighting is fully fledged, and for both sides, civilians are just potential collateral damage. They're not targeting civilians specifically. There doesn't appear to be any element of sort of ethnic cleansing that we are aware of in this. It's a fight between 2 military forces, each trying to secure the upper hand and drive the other one out of control from controlling the key parts of the country. And neither side has a critical advantage, so the fighting is just continuing. And this could continue indefinitely until either there is massive international pressure put on both parties by all their potential backers, suppliers, or they fight themselves to a standstill and acknowledge that neither of them is going to win. They will have to talk. We are a long way from that situation yet, but the potential for international coordination, I think, still exists, and the fact that all countries are getting there, trying to get their citizens and their diplomats out, suggests everybody is equally concerned.
Well, I mean, you have a lot of experience in these things. I mean, you oversaw North Africa, the Middle East, under the auspices of the European Union. What do you think it'll take to push the 2 generals to the negotiating table? Because some have suggested that it may need concerted outside intervention by way of boots on the ground to get them to the table.
Yeah, I've followed the similar kinds of civil conflict in a number of countries, in Yemen, in Libya, in Somalia, and where the international community is divided or different countries line up on different sides, the fighting will continue indefinitely. Each side has their backers, each side is trying to secure an advantage, get more backers, bring in more ammunition, recruit more soldiers, and they believe, because they have international backers, that they are ultimately going to be able to succeed. And in Libya, we've seen that going on for a decade or more. In Yemen, it's been going on for even longer. Somalia is an example where eventually the international community came together because there was an agreed enemy in al-Shabaab who was not backed by anybody. And there you had the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the UN, the EU, the UK, and everybody was saying to Somali politicians, you must settle your differences so that we can help everybody fight al-Shabaab. And at the moment, that is not the situation in Sudan. It's still unclear who are the principal backers of both sides, but they are still getting supplies of arms, and the pressure is not yet united enough to force them to stop and start speaking to each other.
And Professor Westcott, you mentioned Somalia there. I mean, there is a dimension in this war where there is a sort of regional geopolitical convergence, isn't there? Because, I mean, it's not just Sudan itself. You've got other countries around it as well that are in politically difficult situations. I mean, when you look at South Sudan, Eritrea, Chad, Somalia, etc., these aren't stable places for people who are fleeing Sudan to go to, are they?
No, and the Horn of Africa has always been a somewhat delicate and volatile region. And I think the most concerned at the moment may be some of the regional governments, because they see the risk of this fighting spilling over into their own countries. We already know that Ethiopia is very uneasy, and there's news today that the Ethiopian government is trying to reach an agreement with the Oromo rebels. They could very easily get wrapped up into this regional dispute. South Sudan, we know, has had a sort of frozen, intermittent civil war now almost since independence. Somalia, again, al-Shabaab remains a threat, and in Chad too, there is not a particularly stable situation. So all these countries, we could see the whole region disintegrate into warring factions, each seeking allies with the other, which would be a complete disaster. So other neighboring countries, and IGAD has sensibly been in the lead, are being quite energetic in trying to get a peace process going, with the backing of the AU, with the backing of the UN, and with others. So there is an African initiative to try and deal with this because of the huge risk. There may be one or two players in the region who are sitting on their hands waiting for the chaos to continue because they feel they will benefit. And one could perhaps guess that the president of Eritrea feels the weaker everybody else around him, the more influential he can be in the region. But most of them would be deeply worried by this turn of events.
And you mentioned South Sudan there. Let's sort of zero in on that country. I wonder how the people there look at what is now happening to the north. I mean, what sort of knock-on effect is it having, or could it possibly have, on South Sudan? You touched on it briefly, given that the two countries are inextricably linked by history and geography.
And by the oil that South Sudan pumps and is exported through Sudan itself, and which is a significant source of income for both Sudanese and South Sudanese governments. So they are indeed, they have quite a history of tension along their border there, areas like Abyei, which have been in dispute for a long time, rebel movements in the south of Sudan, linked to the SPLM in South Sudan. So again, they have always had interlinked conflicts, but South Sudan has enough conflict of its own. It doesn't want any spillover from the north coming down. And the fact that Sudan has always been quite an important factor in trying to pressure the two sides in South Sudan to reach agreement. So there's a risk that without that outside force, then the deal in South Sudan may be put at risk as well. And it would be an even greater disaster if fighting broke out once more there.
And I mean, the crux of all this fighting, of course, two generals. Just tell us what you know about those two men who are now at war. I mean, how has it come to this? Because they were quite close to each other from what I've read, but at some point their interests started to diverge.
They were, I think you would say, allies of convenience only. They come from extremely different backgrounds, and if you like, they represent two different strands of Sudanese history. General Burhan, head of the Sudan Armed Forces, or titular head of state at the moment, is very much a product of the traditional armed forces, if you like, the Khartoum elite, the Arab speakers based in that region who have tended to dominate the politics of the country since independence. And General Dagalo, better known as Hemeti, represents, if you like, the insurgents from the periphery. He was a Darfuri. He grew up trading camels, and he's had a very varied life, but became a very effective militia leader in charge of the Janjaweed, the Arabic militia who were trying to secure areas for the pastoralists in Darfur against people from further south who had colonized the land, and was adopted by former President Bashir as his sort of personal bodyguard, assuring his security. So he was brought into the establishment to protect Bashir, and also provide a counterbalance to the Sudan armed forces, who have their own interests that they wanted to protect. So for Bashir, he could play them off against each other until it was in the interests of both Burhan and Dagalo to get rid of Bashir because of the pressure from the people. And in all this, we should not forget that there is a population of Sudanese people who want to live in peace. They want to have a representative democracy. The women have been on the streets, the students have been out there. You know, there was a strong pro-democracy movement, but it has been silenced, and it's now hiding. Some of the local resistance committees are still working to try and keep the two sides from fighting each other and doing more damage to the civilian infrastructure, but it's hard work. So the Sudanese people have been more or less silenced in this as these two people fight. But it's a kind of, Hemeti represents, if you like, the insurgency of the periphery against the Khartoum elite. And that's quite a deep-seated difference. And that's why, you know, there's not a lot of common ground. It's winner takes all that both sides are fighting for.
That's a very interesting analysis and very sort of enlightening. And now these two components of the military have veered intentionally towards the, if you like, precipice and pitched the country into a sort of catastrophic free fall. And as foreign citizens leave, Professor Westcott, I mean, many Sudanese nationals, some of whom you're talking about, remain trapped. I mean, I wonder what the Sudanese people think as they watch these foreign nationals escape to safety. I expect the evacuations will be creating anxiety and concern in Sudan that the world is giving up on them.
It does look like that to some of them. They don't have that option of being rescued by an outside power flying in jumbo jets to pull them out. They are stuck there, but it is their country, and they have lost any kind of control over their own fate. So they will certainly be looking at the international community to continue, even if they're taking their people out, to remain engaged in the diplomatic and political pressure on the two sides to try and reach a peace agreement. So they will be looking for the international community to intervene, at least diplomatically. I don't think I can imagine any power wishing to put boots on the ground to try and separate the two sides at this stage. That would only come once there was at least some agreement on a ceasefire, because otherwise whoever intervenes is at the risk of being shot by both sides. Or they come in on one side and not the other, and that would precipitate an even wider general regional conflict. So it would be very, very high risk for anyone. So I think a military intervention remains a long way away. In some ways we hope it's a long way away if the foreign intervention would come in on one side or the other, because that will exacerbate the conflict. But diplomatic intervention is urgent and immediate, and the Sudanese people will be looking for the international community to be as active as possible in pressuring both sides to stop the fighting and start the talking.
And on that note, Professor Westcott, I want to thank you very much indeed for your very illuminating analysis this evening. And Dr. Nicholas Westcott is a former British diplomat, current director of the Royal African Society, who serves as the European Union's Managing Director for Africa and as the EU's MD for the Middle East and North Africa. He's also a Professor of Practice in Diplomacy at the SOAS Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy at the University of London. Thank you very much indeed.